Hello, everyone. As you may know, we are in a new school year, and that means everyone's favorite thing. More new global. Hooray. I'm just kidding, of course, but I am back today, and we'll be back many more times throughout the year to go through this very important global material with you. Let's not waste any time. On today's show, we're discussing revolutions. Let's get right into it. Yeah, so today we are going to be going over the concept of revolutions. And actually, some of the most important thing you need to understand for this unit is that there are two types of revolutions. One's an intellectual one, and one is a political one. And they both happen throughout the course of this unit. One is the Enlightenment. And that's a key example of this type of intellectual revolution that we're talking about here. And some characteristics of intellectual revolutions are that they lead to great political, economic, and or social changes. Intellectual revolutions often challenge existing political, economic, and or social norms. And they tend to lead to real major changes in values and philosophies among a group of people, whether it be a country or continent, or maybe even the whole world. Intellectual revolutions are also often resisted by those who fear a change in the way things are. Most often people who are in charge of the current situation, who have the most power. All right, so that's kind of what an intellectual revolution is like. For a political revolutions tend to serve the interests of the class leading the change. In the French Revolution's case, it was the bourgeoisie, then the sans-culottes as the radical phase continued to take over. Revolutions often do pursue conflicting goals. They were different, even in the height of the French Revolution. There were very strong, different wills pushing forward with every action the revolutionaries decided to take. So that was a very common situation. Political revolutions often do tend to ignore some of the struggles of the lowest classes, and failure to meet needs of the lowest class often lead to radicalization, which is very different, new, sometimes viewed as crazy ideas. So the Enlightenment called into question beliefs and inspired widespread political, economic, and social change. This was an intellectual movement that we used to challenge political authority. So, I mean, if you had to guess, one of the key things is the political authorities, they wouldn't really like that much. It was challenged in Europe and even in colonial rule for the Americans, in places like the 13 colonies and places in the Caribbean. Some of those Enlightenment ideas that obviously were founded in Europe, even spread across the pond to areas like those. So some of the philosophies of the Enlightenment include Enlightenment thinkers developing a political philosophies based on natural laws, which included the concepts of social contracts, the consent of the governed, and the rights of the citizens. Some of the key words you're going to need to know today are absolutism. Absolutism is the theory of abiding by one set of ideas. It's pretty much that simple. Divine right, think of the Lord, and divine right is something a lot of early kings said that they had, was the divine right to rule, so that their people would be challenging God and the king whenever they decided to challenge the king, which was for a long time was a very, very effective strategy. All right, so the absolute monarchy is another term you're going to need to know. It's one king or queen ruler of a country. The social contract is a Enlightenment idea. Natural rights, all rights people are born with. Separation of powers, the judicial, legislative, executive. That's kind of what we have here today with the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. That's how our powers are divided up. So no one person or group of people has control over every little thing in the government. Some of the people you're going to need to know are John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Mary Wollstonecraft, and César Beccaria. First, let's start with Mary Wollstonecraft. She believed that everyone should be taught equal things. She was very much an early feminist of her time. She thought that women and young girls should be educated the same way as men and taught to do whatever they want to do. They should have power over themselves. And that idea really made her stick out in terms of some of the thinkers of her time. She was very much for equality and very much for equality in education throughout. She also, interestingly enough, believed in bettering one's life by themselves, not with the guide of one supreme being or God or ruler or something like that, which is also kind of a little bit of contradictory idea to the popular belief at the time, making her, again, an Enlightenment thinker. Another man was John Locke. He believed in the natural rights to life, liberty, and property, which is fundamental to the U.S. Declaration of Independence. That's where it was mostly used, and we still feel the great impacts of it to this day, really. He believed everyone was born with certain amounts of rights and just certain principles that they had the ideas for. And then Baron de Montesquieu, or for short, Montesquieu, believed in separation of powers. France, the United States, and some even Latin American nations use separation of powers in new constitutions, or now in some cases they're not new, but the idea of separating, as I said before, judicial, legislative, executive, those were very, very popular ideas. Freedom of thought and expression was something Voltaire believed very strongly in. He thought that it was your right to say pretty much whatever you want, and you may not agree with it, but Voltaire would fight to the death for your right to say whatever you want. Beccaria was big in the abolishment of torture, which was in the Bill of Rights, and throughout Europe, religious freedom was Voltaire's big thing as well. Another one that he implemented to a pretty large degree. And finally, our last Enlightenment thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a pretty positive guy. He believed in the innate goodness of man and believed basic human rights were founded upon universal natural law. In addition, he believed that both rulers and citizens should have a natural human rights as well as obligations to each other, which would be bound in some sort of a social contract. So he was very much a positive thinker, positive about the rights people had, similar in a way to the ideas of John Locke, although they did come from different places, so which is a little interesting in it of itself. All right, so now we move from some of those Enlightenment ideas of equality, more rights, and all that kind of stuff, to another phase. And one of the major phases here was the idea of the French Revolution and how the French Revolution, we're now getting into the part of our podcast of where the French Revolution is beginning to brew. And one chart probably, I think, really that you may see in the test is really a good idea, does a good idea of encapsulating it. Some of the anger that the third estate, or the commoners, felt towards the second estate, which is the nobility, and the first estate, which is the clergy, about the way things were going. So, just keep in mind here, for the population, this general makeup of France, 98% was the third estate. So, it was pretty much, the commoners were almost everyone. 1.5% of the population was noble, and 0.5% were religious, which is the clergy. Clergy is religious. You should definitely do well to remember that. 0.5% of the population, clergy, owned 10% of the land, 25% of the land went to the nobles, and 65% of the land went to 98% of the country, or the third estate. Government taxation, however, that was even less fair. It was 100% on the third estate. So that along with a lot of other causes, made the French Revolution kind of take into effect. So, yeah, just the general rage about the way things were going. People just didn't have enough money to live. They were just kind of really starved and cramped out of a lot of the things that they really needed to survive. It wasn't just living well, it was just living at a certain point. I think people were really getting desperate for something to change. Politically, some of the major causes of the revolution included that people just have people just had no real say with the government, and people just felt like, quite accurately, that the government wasn't listening to them, and they abused really the amounts of high power that they had. If you looked, just for example, at the budget of the government here and the royal, the income and the spending of the French monarchy, what they spent on mostly was 42 million livres was spent on the royal household, which is something that caught a lot of people's eye. A lot of money on foreign wars that really France was losing, and a lot of incredible amount of money. The most out of all the money spent was 261.1 million livres, which is interest payments on debts they'd already rang up. At a certain point, just got to be really too much. There was significant class warfare going on in France, mostly between the second and third estates, as Enlightenment ideals were also on the rise. There was also massive income inequality, and again, as I said before, serious debt from losing colonies, which is also they fought a war where they lost pretty much all their power in North America, which took away a lot of the funds that they were able to bring back into France for their people, and some of Louis XVI's extravagant spending eventually would catch up with him there. So that leads to the French Revolution and the moderate stage. And as this spending situation gets out of control, Louis and Jacques Necker convene the Estates General. And that was a very, very big situation where Jacques Necker, who's a popular economic advisor that the people really like. The people are glad that the king hired him. He's way more popular than the king. Says, okay, we got to get the Estates General, which is representatives from all three estates, to come in and talk about how to solve this. But the thing was, the nobles had one vote, the people had one vote, and the clergy had one vote. And that was obviously unfair because, as I said before, 98% of the population is the people, and the clergy could just very, very easily bond with the nobles and outvote them on almost everything. So things weren't really going well, and the first and second estates kicked the third estates out of the negotiating room, so in the palace where they were meeting at Versailles. So they decided to form on a tennis court. They said, we are going to form a national assembly and we're going to keep meeting with the National Assembly until we get a new constitution and do some real change here. And that was what they ended up getting. But it did go a little bit awry. So yeah, we're going to discuss that. And this was an aspect, we're going to discuss more about that later, but the fact that they made this tennis court oath, that they were really wanting a new constitution, that made the king mad, and he brought some troops to the border of Paris, where most of a very large majority, at least, of some of the peasants, and so a lot of the third estate lived. So they felt really, really threatened, and they felt they needed to fight back. What did they do? Well, they stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison/fort where there was a lot of gunpowder, and they needed that gunpowder, so they literally stormed it and attacked it. Some of the royal troops that were guarding it, they were almost completely overwhelmed, and they were like, okay, this is not going to work, and they pretty much just got crushed. And this really, really represented a direct and incredibly violent blow, because they were very violent in going about it, against the French feudal system and the basic, really, government structure of France. So then, after that, the National Assembly issued a decree that pretty much abolished the feudal system. Like, they're like, what do you do if your government, the people who you're governing say, I don't like the government anymore, we're just not going to abide by it, we're going to do our own thing. And that's pretty much what they did here. They passed this decree that said the French people no longer want to be part of the old feudal system of government. It was a really further attack against the French monarchy, which showed things were getting quite serious. And then came the big one. It was the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. It was documented, issued by the revolutionary forces that outlined kind of their demands for the future, what they wanted the rights to do. Oh, by the way, and also the feudal system thing was a pretty much, they said anyone who is called Sir, Marquis, or whatever, any count, whatever noble position. Marquis was a very common noble position in France. There's no addressing of noble positions. Everything is just citizen. Like, that's the address that you are supposed to give your fellow man. You're not supposed to treat anyone with any higher respect. And if people ask for that, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, because people were